Welcome to the James Rowe Show on the Barroom Sports Talk Network. I'm James Rowe. And again, Bryan has joined the show, and let's all congratulate him. I always give him grief for not having any friends and stuff like that, but he actually had a social event this week.
That's
Congratulations!
Right. We actually went out for dinner for the first time in a long time. Did a little socially distant dinner, but that was fun. It was good to get out of the apartment for sure, but had to push back the podcast by a day. So thanks for moving.
I can't believe you actually went out and did something social. I mean, your girlfriend must be so proud of you.
She is. We're actually getting out in the world. So.
Well, anyways, let's get into it. Usually we're 5 minutes after like superlatives and all this stuff. We're actually getting into it right away. Hard to believe we're actually doing that. Well, let's get into what this podcast will be talking about first, and that's obviously the big game that's happening on Friday.
Yeah.
At 4 o'clock, the Rose Bowl in Texas against Alabama, the Crimson Tide. And for a chance in the semifinal playoff to play for the national championship.
Yeah.
Bryan, this is going to be an interesting one.
Yeah, it is. And we talked a little bit about it last week and the point spread that opened up. I think it's the largest opening point spread in the history of the college football playoff for any game, let alone for just a semifinal at 17.5. And I think it's only gotten worse for Notre Dame. I checked right before jumping on, and I think it's at 19.5 right now. So Vegas, the odds makers, not giving Notre Dame any love against Alabama. I think to have a spread like that, it's twofold. One, a little bit of disrespect to Notre Dame, and two, a tremendous amount of respect being given to Alabama.
Absolutely. And I think, honestly, I'm going to have to drink a lot during that game because it might be a little scary what happens.
What do you got there?
Yeah, I actually got Christmas Ale Great Lakes. I'm being a little festive right now.
Nice. All right. I'm drinking a Stone Salt and Lime Lager we picked up today. Pretty good. So I'm trying to, stick to some smaller brews.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. Well, now let's just break down this game. So I think the first part is let's look into Notre Dame's offense. So the numbers I've got here, and I've got a lot of numbers. If you see this in this vidcast, if you don't see the podcast, I got basically 2 pages worth.
Our stat team's been working on that all week.
AKA just me. Well, luckily enough, I do a thing called researching. You got to be prepared to do this stuff. But anyways, so one of the interesting things I saw was that Notre Dame's offense, points per game is 35.2. That's ranked 21st in the country. For the yards per game, it's 45.2, which is 22nd. Now, the red zone offense percentage says it's 78.6%, which is, looks like from my handwriting, it says 94th. And then their third down percentage is 49.7%, which is 9th. So it doesn't seem like they score a whole heck of a lot in the end zone because they don't need to. And if you're scoring a lot of points like they are, but still have that low of a red zone offense, it just goes to show that we won't have to worry too much of what's going to happen. And then 3 games against the top 40 scoring defenses, they had 39.0 points per game in those games and 32.0 in regulation. The rematch against Clemson dropped that to 29.3 points per game, but that's nothing really to worry about because, it was not a good game by any stretch with what happened in that matchup. Now, what's interesting, let's get into Alabama's defense. And this is where things are going to get key. Because Alabama's defense for points per game is 19.5, which is 17th. That's respectable. The yards per game is 351.2, which is 31st. The red zone defensive percentage is 76.7%, which is 27th. But the third down defensive percentage is 40.6%, which is 71st. And Alabama gave up 47.0 points per game in 2 games against top 25 scoring offenses. And guess what Notre Dame is? A top 25. So that's a really promising statistic right there. What's even going to be more interesting, now if you get into the nitty-gritty of the statistics, is that Notre Dame's rush offense ranked 20th with 217.6 yards per game. Alabama's rush defense ranked 12th with 107 yards per game. Notre Dame played 3 games against other opponents ranked top 10 in rushing defense. Alabama played 1 team in the top 25 rushing offense, and Ole Miss. So those numbers are skewed. Alabama has only played 1 top 25 rushing offense, and Ole Miss. And that's why the numbers that Alabama has right now that look so good is a little flawed. And then what's interesting is Kyron Williams is the first 1,000-yard back that Alabama has faced this year. So that's where I think things are going to get interesting, is what Notre Dame does on the ground. And then lastly, for the Notre Dame's pass offense, ranked was 56, and with a 237.5 yards per game. Alabama's pass defense ranked 78th with 243.5 yards per game. So Alabama's numbers were inflated because they played teams that were so poor throwing the ball in 3 competitive games. Opposing QBs threw for in 3 competitive games, opposing QBs threw for 352 yards per game. That's where Ian Book is going to need to be a key factor in this game.
Yeah.
And I don't know if he's going to be able to do it. And let's hope like maybe Braven Lenzy is able to come back because they need that speed. I mean, they've got Skowronek and they got Michael Mayer, they've got Tremble, Brock Wright. They've got plenty of options. But Ian Book's going to need to be really on this game.
I hear you, and some of these stats are strange, man, because Alabama has just – we'll get to the other side of the ball, but their offense has run away from other teams all year long. And where I think some of these other teams they're playing, their opponents are gunning and dropping back, throwing more than they planned, maybe getting out of their scheme to start it. Nobody's running the ball against Alabama consistently. So some of those yardage things maybe get skewed a little bit because it turns into a little bit more of a shootout, trying to throw and be more aggressive in that regard. But you just look at their last few games. I mean, Florida gave them a great game in the SEC title game, but so they win against Florida 52-46. Game before that, 52-3 against Arkansas. Game before that, 55-17 against LSU. Put up 42 against Auburn, 63 against Kentucky, 41-0 against Mississippi State. So they have no problem scoring. And in a lot of those games, 3 points, 0 points, those are Power 5 teams now, not top tier Power 5 teams by any means, but that they're blanking or holding to 3 points the whole game. So I hear you on that there is maybe some stats that point to Alabama's defense being a little bit suspect, but I think some of that's just driven by how good their offense is, and then the defense just is maybe playing a little bit more prevent and allowing some of that under stuff because they have such a lead.
It's like they're sort of coasting in a way. I mean, they don't necessarily have to shut down the other offense, just as long as their offense continues what it does.
And sometimes they still do shut down the other offense.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
I mean, if you got like a corner like Patrick Surtain, I mean, you guys are in pretty good shape. But now that goes into the next talking point of what we were just saying, is that Alabama's offense points per game was 49.7, which is second in all of college football. The yards per game, 543.9, fifth. Red zone percentage, 91.7%, 11th. The third down percentage, 59.2%, that's first. So where does Notre Dame rank in that situation when on the other side of the ball? Well, there is a lot of confidence if you look at the numbers because Notre Dame's defense has been pretty good and pretty much been, I would say, a big deciding factor of why they're in the playoffs or we're at their position right now. So the points per game is 18.6, which is ranked 14th. The yards per game is 335.1, which is 20th. Now the red zone percentage says 85.7%, ranking 81st, but that's a bit deceptive because Notre Dame really has kept teams out of the red zone this year. So it is more likely that teams like North Carolina or Clemson had more opportunities to get into those situations. But Notre Dame didn't really need to worry about the red zone because they weren't allowing it.
Yeah.
But the third down percentage, now this one's actually a really interesting one, 29.4%. That's sixth. So that's a good matchup right there, just on third down percentage. It shows that, Clark Lee's defense is confident. They have the right guys to get into those situations and then do whatever they do.
Yeah, and this is where I think the game's going to be decided. I mean, the other side's interesting to me as well, but I think it could get out of hand really quickly on this side of the ball, just with Alabama's offense and what we saw against Clemson, right? I'm just worried this Alabama offense is firing on all cylinders, right? It's not just the running attack Alabama we saw in 2010, 2011, 2012 Alabama's, right? It's this new Mac Jones led Steve Sarkisian kind of firing on all cylinders sort of offense where they can beat you throwing down the field and then still run the ball all over you. I think Najee Harris is averaging like 6 yards a carry, what you'd expect from an Alabama running back. But, Mac Jones has a higher QB rating than Joe Burrow did last year, right? So take QB rating for what it's worth, but still it shows you just the efficiency and where he's playing is at an elite level. So it's not just I think maybe some casual fans or maybe some who are just tuning in for the playoffs and really haven't watched Alabama over the last couple of years with Sarkisian there are going to be expecting maybe an Alabama team that you typically see traditionally, just a run down your throat, ball control type of offense. And that's certainly not this team and hasn't been for some time. One stat that jumped out to me that we talked about, they've outscored their opponents 132-37 in the first quarter.
Oh.
And so this could just be brutal if they get out ahead of Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame needs to be competitive and start establishing the run early on their offense to really keep this high-powered Alabama offense off the field and try to keep the score lower. I think a lower scoring game is better for Notre Dame if it gets into a shootout. I just don't think Ian Book and the offense have the firepower to really compete with Alabama.
Well, here's another thing. Now that you mentioned Najee Harris, and I'm actually glad that you brought that up. So Alabama's rush offense is 189.8 yards per game, which is 44th. But if you look at Najee Harris's numbers, they're elite. It's probably the best way you put it. However, Notre Dame's rushing defense is 110.6 yards per game, which is 15th. That's where things are going to get a little interesting because if Notre Dame can hold Najee Harris, essentially, and they've been doing that with a lot of great running backs in the ACC, then, I mean, you have a fighting chance, essentially.
Yeah.
And then, but what's another interesting is Alabama's passing offense. Now, just because it's led by Mac Jones, that is 354.1 yards per game, which is fifth. And they have Devontae Smith, who's probably going to be winning the Heisman Trophy.
Really?
Yes, I think he
Wow.
is. But
Go ahead.
If they were able to get Jalen Waddle back from injury, then all the bets are off, and you might as well just hand Alabama the national championship because the two of those guys, when you have to face them, I mean, those are two of the best wide receivers in the game or in college football. So,
oh yeah.
So the problem is, I'm looking at Notre Dame's passing defense, is that it's 224.5 yards per game, which is 57th. That's where things I get a little bit concerned. Now, if they're able to hold down Devontae Smith, great.
Mhm.
But if they have to deal with both Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle, game over.
Yeah, no, and you hit. I'm glad you brought up Smith because I wanted to talk about him when talking about Alabama's offense. You know, the Alabama offenses of old, even though they had these top tier wide receivers who were probably the most talented wide receiver in college football. You think of, your Julio Jones, your Calvin Ridley, your Amari Coopers that have come through Alabama. Each year, they're some of the most talented, if not the most talented at Alabama. And some of those older years, it was a run-heavy offense, and you just didn't really get to see them much. They'd maybe get a couple catches here or there, and they proved themselves on those touches. But Smith is getting those touches and continuing to prove himself. I think he has 1,500 yards, which in college is ridiculous for 11 games. He has 17 touchdowns in 11 games, almost 100 catches. So I hear you on, it'd be interesting, and I would love to see a wide receiver win the Heisman. But if anyone does, Smith has put up the numbers this year, especially. When do they do the Heisman voting? I could be even mistaken. Has it already been voted on, or do they get to enjoy the playoffs and how they play during that period?
I think it has been done. I'm not positive.
Yeah.
That's something I think that probably we'll talk about in the next podcast, just as like a sidebar thing. But that's a good question. That's something I'll have to look up. Otherwise, it might be this weekend for all I know.
Yeah.
And I think going back to your point about Alabama being run heavy back in the days, obviously they had Mark Ingram, and I believe he was paired up with Trent Richardson. So that was
true. Yeah.
That's a really powerful back tandem. And then they've had someone like Bo Scarborough or something. But Najee Harris, of all of them, has, in my opinion, been the most impressive, just because simply how Saban's offense has just become such not one-dimensional anymore. It's definitely balanced. You've got high five-star recruit guys at wide receiver, tight end, running back, and then you've got that offensive line that just protects anyone. I mean, Jalen Hurts did well there. Tua Tagovailoa was great with that offensive line, and now obviously Mac Jones. And Mac Jones, I think, has arguably made a great case to be a top 10 NFL draft pick, and also
he's my pick for the Heisman. Yeah,
I think he's Heisman too. I just think Devontae Smith is going to.
You can't have two Heisman winners, James. You picked Smith and Mac Jones.
Oh. I'm saying I think Smith is going to win it. I'm just saying my personal choice.
If you had a vote.
Now, I've heard people say Kyle Trask. And I'm like, I don't know. But
he had a great year in Florida.
Yeah, neither here nor there about Florida. I mean, they're just probably chomping at at being relevant again.
So you're right. I looked it up while you were talking. The votes have been in for the Heisman, and they have kind of the results for the 5 through 10, and I didn't even realize Ian Book. I think he was number 9 in the Heisman voting.
Yeah, he was a candidate. That's correct.
Made the final listing, but not in the top 4. Those invited to New York: Trask, Smith, Jones, and Trevor Lawrence. So very high. I mean, I could see Trevor Lawrence coming out with that Heisman as well this year. Obviously, he missed some time. But if anyone also deserves to win it, you could put it to him too. I see both. Alabama's just too good on the offensive side this year, and Najee Harris was number 5, I think, in the Heisman voting. So it's not like he was far off, even getting invited to New York as well. They could have had 3 people there, which would have been nuts.
Oh my God! I mean, it's just think of all that amount of talent that Alabama has, and that's why I think a lot of Irish fans are definitely nervous and should be nervous about this game. I'm certainly nervous.
Well, let's talk about that too. Like, what drives some of that nerves? Maybe before we've talked about Alabama. I think everyone knows Alabama, but Notre Dame fans are familiar with Alabama, right? From the
Mhm.
2012 game, or I guess it was 2013 after the 2012 season, obviously the BCS title game, where Notre Dame went to Miami, played, I think, the Manti Te'o after all of the catfished girlfriend
Oh my
fiasco that
God,
happened
yeah.
that year. Just got blown out by Nick Saban's team. I think the final score was 42-14, if I had that right. That's right. And I was actually at that game, and we wanted to leave right at about halftime. It was just clearly two different skill levels of teams.
Yeah.
Um, and that game really set back and kind of set some of the reputation of, all the Notre Dame haters came out and said, they're not this top tier level team and they should have never been in that game. And you'll have that with any blowout in the BCS title game or even in the playoffs now. Notre Dame didn't do themselves any favors in the semifinal when they were here back in 2 years ago, right, against Clemson. They got blown out by the eventual national champs. So I think there's just nervousness with Notre Dame fans in general of, where do we match up against these top tier teams, these top five teams that are traditionally there, the Ohio States, Clemson's, Alabama's, and the like. So I think there's some of that. Then, you come in as number 4, you're pinned up against the number 1, everybody's number 1 overall team here in Alabama that's just been completely dominant all year long.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, right now, a lot of people are probably saying like, "Oh, see, uh, them being in the conference, the ACC is what is going to help Notre Dame a lot." Though I think we made that argument before that that's a very flawed argument, just because of the scheduling that
Money.
allows money, but also the scheduling that allows like people like USC and Stanford and
Yeah.
other top tier programs to play against Notre Dame that Notre Dame has to go up against and show how good they are. But I do think if you're playing in a conference like SEC, then that kind of has a better benefit just because of how great that conference is. And they're able to, I mean, the recruiting that they get down there is just amazing.
Yeah.
So that's kind of going a little bit off the rails, and I think that could be something talked about at another point. But here are some of my keys for Notre Dame to defeat Alabama, because I actually think
Hit me with it.
This is, I think, in my opinion, a winnable game for Notre Dame.
Okay.
Do I think they'll win? We'll talk about it later on. But here's some of the things I have. Mitigating Alabama's damage on offense and matching them score for score. Now that's the mitigating part might not be as hard to do, but the matching them score for score might be, because if Alabama just gets ahead, it's gonna be very difficult to hold them down, and the game's over after 2 touchdowns essentially. The offensive line, now that's gonna be really key. Obviously, Notre Dame's got either the best or one of the top 5 offensive lines in the country, and it must disrupt Alabama's defensive line and protect Ian Book at all costs, because Ian Book is going to be a key on offense. Another one is establishing the run, as Notre Dame has the advantage on the ground, but that's going to be depending on what Notre Dame does against Najee Harris as well.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the last one, I think this is a really important one, is controlling the ball, because Notre Dame is ranked 9th in time of possession at 34 minutes and 12 seconds. If Notre Dame can get like a run here, run there, short pass here, short pass there, and
Get
be able
drives
to
going.
You keep the drives going, but also keeping the ball away from Alabama's or from Mac Jones's hands, for that matter, that's going to be really helpful. If they can get 2 touchdowns there, and let's say they do match Alabama's score for score and keep possession of the ball, then essentially this is a winnable game and realistically have a chance.
Yeah, that's the only way I see them kind of having a chance to win the game, is dominating the offensive line when they have the ball, and really having Kyron Williams having a great game. I mean, they average over 200 yards rushing a game. And if they can do that and kind of establish themselves against a very stout Alabama defense, then they'll have success. And to your point, keeping Mac Jones off the field. But it's just going to be so tough. I think Alabama is just another level of talent all throughout their roster, including on the defensive line. And Notre Dame has talent at the wide receiver position, but doesn't have breakaway speed, dynamic talent. It has those tall kind of wide receivers. They almost remind me of an Alabama team. When we talked about these early mid 2000, kind of 2010 Alabama, if you will, or something like that, of run first and then kind of having some big physical receivers on the outside. But you're right. I think Notre Dame's defense lines up well against Najee Harris and the run game there as best as you can, right? I don't think they're going to shut him down completely, but I do think if Notre Dame's defense has a strength that's against the run, it's the secondary that gives me concerns, right? And just Smith, I could see having a couple big plays to really break this game open.
Mm-hmm.
Notre Dame secondary's kind of shown at times, especially against Clemson in the last game, that they are susceptible to big plays. So if they can limit those, especially early, not that there's ever a great time for a big play, but if you survive the first quarter or two, I think Notre Dame is in a much better position to actually make a competitive game. If they get down 2 touchdowns in the first quarter, I think it could get really ugly really quickly. Just because Notre Dame would have to abandon the run, and it's just not a game strategy where they'll be successful.
I mean, sure, they've got Javon McKinley and Braden Lindsey if he's healthy in this game, and all the other ones who I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of talent and a lot of options for Ian Book, but I don't think it's the same type of quality as Alabama's. Like obviously with Devontae Smith and possibly Jaden Waddle coming back from injury, so that's where things are just like, ooh, that's difficult, and you definitely kind of grimace when you look at the names and the numbers, and then you all of a sudden get like a Charlie Horse, and you're like, we're not going to do well. Anyway, so as we talked before this podcast, I was going to say the preview was obviously going to be the biggest chunk of what we're going to talk about. So before we get into the next talking points, let's do our predictions.
Yes.
Bryan, the floor is yours.
Well, this is tough. Like I said, I was there in 2013 when Alabama just ran all over Notre Dame, and unfortunately, I think this Alabama team is better than that Alabama team was.
Yeah.
I think the Notre Dame team's maybe better as well, but I think the talent differential is just too much for Notre Dame to overcome. I could see this being I would say 42-17 game with Alabama taking the win. I just don't think Notre Dame has the firepower to keep up, and I think Alabama's just going to run away with it.
See, I don't think Alabama.
What about you, James? What do you say?
I don't think Alabama is going to score nearly that amount of points just because they're facing a better defense than they've had to face in the SEC.
I mean, they put 52 up against Florida.
Who said that they had the good defense, though?
Fair.
But I just can't see Book and the offense matching them because Alabama's just too good. It's just too good. And I think if Alabama's going to score 35, and I'm going to kind of cheat here a little bit. I'm going to say that between 20 and 25 points, Notre Dame will score.
For the Irish?
Yeah, I think that's just.
So you have a little more competitive than I did, but still Alabama coming away with the win.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of playing catch up too. I think even though the score may look like it's down by 10 points, it probably won't be as competitive as we think. But who knows? Like I said, a lot of these keys that I just mentioned, I think it's realistic that Notre Dame can win, but how realistic, that's the better question. And I just think we all know what Nick Saban does down there in Tuscaloosa. We all know the numbers that we just went over, and then you just look at the tape and everything, and it's just kind of hard to say Notre Dame's got this. It's just too difficult.
Yeah.
So, all right, now let's go into our next talking point, and that is, let's say hypothetically the team loses on Friday. Is this a successful season? And Bryan, the floor is yours for this one.
Yeah, I think so. I think your standard right now at Notre Dame is getting to the playoff. If you can get to the playoff consistently, look, I mean, this is, and not even consistently, like you just have to be realistic. There's only 4 teams that make it into the playoff every year. This has to be considered a successful season for Notre Dame. Just considering all that happened with, every program ran into COVID issues, but Notre Dame only having 1 loss and coming into the playoff, this is where you want to be at the end of the year, playing against an Alabama, playing against these type of teams. Sure, you'd like to be undefeated and ACC title game champions, but Clemson's a great team. So I think this is a great success for Notre Dame. Another great year for Brian Kelly, who's had a history here, kind of tacking them on the last few years. But what do you think? I mean, obviously there's kind of crazy Notre Dame fans out there who have, championship or bust sort of mentality, but I still see success in kind of building a program and Notre Dame taking another step there this year.
Well, I mean, I think you and I are a little bit more realistic with sometimes how fans expect things, but we as Notre Dame fans expect them to championship or bust. But there's different ways of quantifying what's successful and what's not successful. And this year, 100% is successful. I mean, especially the whole pandemic and everything and being forced to play in the ACC. Obviously, they benefited from being in the ACC for getting to the playoffs just because they're able to play in the ACC championship. They were able to have a better resume they will show they had a good resume and all that stuff. And,
I mean, had they not been in a title game, they'd be undefeated and in the playoff, right?
Oh, 100%. 100%.
So maybe they didn't benefit from being in the ACC for the title game piece.
Right. No, right. But I'm just saying that helped get them talked about because there's so many people who just say, oh, they're independents. They may look like they have a strong schedule, but they don't know what it's like to play in a conference. Well, this year they played in conference, and look what happened. They played in the ACC championship. But overall, I mean, even if they lose to Alabama, this is a successful year. I mean, you want to get to the playoffs every single year. A fighting chance to win and move on and win the national championship.
Fighting chance for the Fighting Irish.
And then another thing that's successful about this is some of the accolades that they've gotten. Our beloved Kyron Williams was named ACC Offensive Rookie of the Year. And then 12 players were on the All-ACC team, and 7 were honorable mentions. So that's 19 players right there. It just goes to show what Brian Kelly is building. I think that, depending on who takes over for Ian Book at quarterback, I think Brian Kelly has established a team that is there for long-term success, and I think playoffs or bust is realistic for the next 3 years.
Yeah, so let's take this another step further, though. I mean, we both see Notre Dame, and we can talk about this next week after the game, but we both see Notre Dame losing against Alabama. Let's say they lose by a 40-20 kind of score, and it's not as competitive maybe as some of the other games have been. I mean, do you still keep this as a successful season, or are you kind of taking that into account is what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, the fact that they made it to the playoffs is just successful in itself.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it would be so much better if they won the whole thing, but but I mean, what all the craziness and everything, they're able to still do well. And even if, let's say, hypothetically, there was no pandemic and they were not in the ACC and they went 12-0 and they made the playoffs, and let's say lose to Alabama, this would still be a successful season. But I think, there's just so many things. There's kind of an unfair year to so many schools, including Notre Dame, and it was definitely a successful season, regardless of how you look at it.
I do think that if Notre Dame gets blown out here, it'll kind of perpetuate this narrative that we've been talking about. And, I think I'm not telling anybody anything new right here, right? That Notre Dame can't win these big bowl games.
Mhm.
And maybe that Brian Kelly can't win these big bowl games, right? And, what do you think about that, of kind of that? I mean, I saw after the Clemson game, some people on Twitter were kind of calling for Brian Kelly to get fired or his job. They need to replace him. What's kind of your reaction to that? I know some of that's just Twitter noise, but
Well, I guess you led into our next talking point is, should Brian Kelly be fired? And 100% no. I mean, look what he's built. I mean, the last 2 of the last 3 seasons he made the playoffs. He had a good chance of making the playoffs last year, but then things went on the wayside. But overall, I mean, the only time I thought maybe that Brian Kelly should have had his seat hot was a hot seat or whatever.
yeah,
Was after that 2016 embarrassing season. I mean,
yeah,
you went 4-8, and that was just brutal. And I was actually probably one of those people who was at that time clamoring for Brian Kelly to be fired. But since 2017, I've kind of noticed a lot what Brian Kelly has done, and then this year has really kind of come into focus of what the type of coach he is. And I was like, they cannot let this guy go. This guy is a great coach, and I think he's right now is the second winningest coach in history. He's right behind Newt Rockne, and we all know the god he is. And he has a chance to pass Rockne soon.
Yeah.
So think about that. The fact that Kelly could be the winningest coach in Notre Dame history soon, and people are still claiming that he needs to be fired, is just absurd.
Yeah.
And then I here's the thing and we talked about this right before we started the podcast. I was going through Facebook, and a Notre Dame fan.
That's your first mistake.
Yeah, exactly. But this was a great thing. So credit to the fan. I don't know who the fan is, but thank you for posting it. It was from an ESPN article, and I think this goes to show how good of a coach that Kelly is. So this is what it says, and these are 3 paragraphs. The Irish have signed only 10 top 100 prospects over the past 5 recruiting cycles, compared to 49 for Alabama, 34 for Ohio State, and 30 for Clemson. That they have found their way back to the playoff for a second time under Brian Kelly without many elite recruits is impressive. Compared to Alabama's 9 5-star signings, Notre Dame hasn't had any in the same span, but has built a stout defense and used its strength along the offensive line to move its offense forward. Of the 47 ESPN 300 recruits, Notre Dame signed 12. And they were all along the offensive line, which shows the success the Irish have had at recruiting the position group and the emphasis up front to ensure great line play throughout the past few years. So what I interpreted out of that is they're not necessarily getting the most elite talent out there, but what they're getting is a quantity so that it's building up enough depth, and also his ability to coach these players to play at an elite level.
Well, and like there are only so many 5 stars, right? Like to your point, there's like Notre Dame is not recruiting like a slouch here. They're still having top 10 classes. They're doing well on the recruiting side compared to so many other programs. It's only when you hold them up against these other college football playoff teams, the Alabama, the Clemsons, the Ohio States, that maybe their numbers don't stack up. And really, I think the start is just being in the conversation with those teams gets you those recruits. If you are showing yourselves and showing up in these big bowl games, right? Because recruits watch these. And if you get blown out by Alabama, it does hurt your recruiting. Maybe not that next year, but years down the line, just your reputation of not being able to perform in those big games. But yeah, to your point, I don't know if it's as much of a development thing, because I think Notre Dame's kind of performed to where those recruits are coming in. I mean, they're coming in as traditionally top 10 recruiting classes, and Notre Dame's finishing in the top 10, right? So, with that talent level. And I do think Kelly's done a great job of kind of building that recruiting pipeline, but then also taking, Ian Books of the world and kind of building them into Heisman caliber quarterbacks, right? And maybe not Heisman caliber, but at least in the conversation of top 10 players. So I look at the last few years, and to your point on 16, I agree, right? They were 4-8 that year, a down year of just kind of talent and kind of reset the roster that year. The next, like since 16 though, they've been great. I think each one of those, this year included 4 straight 10-win plus seasons. They've been in that conversation towards the end of the year, whether it's 3-loss, 1-loss, 2-loss teams. They've gone to the playoff twice in that span. That's the kind of streak you want to see of building a program forward. And I think consistently have 11, 10, 12 win seasons. I don't know how you can do any better than that. So Notre Dame would be foolish to move on. So I agree completely that keeping Brian Kelly.
And then this whole narrative that Brian Kelly can't win these big games. Well, this year he proved that that's a whole bunch of, as I'd love to say it, malarkey.
What? Well,
and the reason why I'll get to the no part, true. But what I'm saying yes is because he had a win against Clemson. He had a win against North Carolina, and North Carolina is a top 15 team. And look what they did to Miami, who was ranked 10 at that point. They just obliterated them. Now, North Carolina has a great offense, and Clemson is Clemson. I mean, there's a reason why they're in these playoffs. I mean, they're at least I think they are the second most elite team.
But to the average fan, right? That Clemson game was without Trevor Lawrence. When Trevor Lawrence was there, you saw the result in the final scoreline, right? The difference between Clemson and Notre Dame. And North Carolina's, still a good team this year, but doesn't carry the reputation of that top 5 teams that the Alabamas, Oklahomas, Ohio States carry year to year. So Notre Dame has to beat one of those guys on the big stage. And Alabama, when you talk about an opportunity to really catapult this program forward, I don't think Notre Dame's going to win, but if you talk about a game that could move Notre Dame up into that elite threshold, it's winning this game. So it's a great opportunity for Brian Kelly, right, to move him from this great Notre Dame coach to just a great overall coach, in all of college football, if he's not there already.
And I think honestly, what Kelly is building will get them into that elite threshold. It might take a few more years down the line, but like I said, as I was making a point, was you're already seeing him building that long-term success.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure. It could be in a couple of years that they finally start getting those 5-star recruits that Alabama and Clemson and Ohio State are getting. But
I don't think you're going to do it. I'll pause you there just because, like Notre Dame, one, it has its standards, which it's relaxed a little bit, but two, it's South Bend, Indiana is tough to recruit to, right? Versus, good weather in LSU, good weather at Florida, right? Like these great, it's just really tough to recruit. And I think tradition means a lot less to, a traditional powerhouse football program. Still carries a lot of weight, but like Notre Dame's tradition means a lot less to 17, 18-year-olds right now, or 16-year-olds who are making their decision, who haven't seen Notre Dame win a championship in their lifetime, right?
Right. Well, and I think I still think the whole thing that Brian Kelly can't win a big game is malarkey, but I will say when it is a situation up going against Alabama, I can understand the fans being like, okay, well, Notre Dame's not quite at that threshold. And, we talk about that in the Clemson game. There was no Trevor Lawrence. There's no Strowski. There's a couple other players that they were missing on defense. But also, Notre Dame was missing a few offensive weapons. However,
no one's going to remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But
yeah.
Whether or not they would have won that game had Trevor Lawrence been healthy, it could be debated. I think, honestly, the score line probably would have been just as close as it would have been as the score was, even with, let's say, Lawrence being healthy for that game. But, look at the numbers that his backup, DJ Uiagalelei, those were so much better than what Lawrence put up just by stats recognition than Lawrence did in the ACC championship. But I think I talked about this in the last podcast. Lawrence is such a veteran. He's able to navigate all these things, and that's why, it probably would have been a different game. Not probably would have been a different game had Lawrence been healthy.
Mhm.
But I still think because they are just facing each other for the first time, I think it would have been pretty even. Whether Notre Dame would have won that game or not, I don't know. Good question. And who knows? I mean, they probably would have played in an ACC championship. The same score happens.
Yeah.
And guess what happens? Notre Dame's not in the playoffs.
All right, let's sidebar here.
Yeah.
Because I think we've beaten up this Notre Dame Alabama game enough, and we're all excited for the game here in 2 days now. What do you, the other game on the docket, the other semifinal that we haven't been talking about, Clemson Ohio State? It's actually really interesting to me, even as a Notre Dame fan. Just I love kind of the rivalry that's building up for this game because Dabo's been in Ohio State in Ohio State's minds disrespecting that team, right? I think his final rankings put Ohio State at number 11 in the rankings, which obviously the media picks up on. He's been saying for all year that maybe they shouldn't be in the playoff because they've only played so many games. What are your thoughts with great Ohio State team, a great Clemson team? Obviously these teams have history, right, in the playoffs. So this is just an exciting game to me. This is what you want to see of recurring teams in the playoffs who don't like each other, vying to get into the national title game. It's
gonna be a blowout. And the reason why I say that is I'm not saying that Notre Dame isn't a good enough team. I've been kind of beating a dead horse over what I've been trying to say of why Ohio State shouldn't be in the playoffs. But realistically, if they play the full 11-game season, I might have been able to say, okay, these guys, at least pure talent-wise, deserve to be in. However, I have not been impressed by Ohio State at all. I mean, the best game that they had, or best win they had, was against Indiana, and Justin Fields struggled in that game. And to be fair,
had 3 interceptions, yeah.
I'm going to give him a bit of a leeway on that because Indiana's defense was so stout this year. But at the same point, he didn't really look all that good against Northwestern. And, when they played, it was not a good conference at all. And so Fields probably had an opportunity to put up numbers like Dwayne Haskins was or Joe Burrow was.
Mm-hmm.
And he just really didn't impress me. I mean, I know he's coming back from a thumb injury, which might be a key point. But I think Clemson's just on another level.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, and I don't think it's going to be all that close of a game. I think, honestly, it's going to be a blowout.
I would love to see – I mean, yeah, I think Ohio State is amped up to play this game. There's still a lot of emotion, even at the pro level, but especially at the college level, of these players playing up when the emotions riding with them. And I think Ohio State and Ryan Day is playing that disrespect card perfectly coming into this game. So I see them having a really good game. But to your point, the other side I want to bring up here, Ohio State's secondary has been suspect. Like Indiana picked them apart, and Trevor Lawrence is not the quarterback you want to go against when you have a suspect secondary. That Indiana game, they had blown coverages all over the place, and Trevor Lawrence, if you do that against Trevor Lawrence, he will make you pay and won't miss that throw. So could see this. You're right. I could see Clemson winning it. I just think though Ohio State has a chip on their shoulder to go against Dabo and this team. And I wouldn't be surprised this is the last game you see Trevor Lawrence play in college football.
And I bet you our good friend Sam will be very excited to see Ohio State get blown out if that's what happens, or just lose in general.
That's right.
But it'd be even more hilarious. Let's say hypothetically Notre Dame and Ohio State were to be playing in a national championship. Even though he's not a fan of Notre Dame, the person who'd be rooting the most for Notre Dame would be Sam. And us Notre Dame fans would be like, "Oh, thanks, Sam. We appreciate your I'm just blinking on the word right now."
Yeah.
But he'd definitely be joining the bandwagon, and he would be throwing obscenities over at Ohio State. But Anyways, I think that pretty much wraps it up. And there's a couple things I just want to say before we leave.
Leave them for next week. Little
well,
nuggets.
Well,
What do you got?
Well, it's not nuggets. It's so we were supposed to have a guest on this week. That mystery guest. Well, he wasn't able.
Remains a mystery.
Remains a mystery, but he wasn't able to make it for the recording today. But had we had it at the normal schedule, because Bryan had to be social, he, if it was that day, he would have been on, and we would have had this great show, in my opinion. And I still think we had a great show this one.
You could have had the show. I don't want to. Yeah, I feel terrible now, man.
No,
you can interview him, and I don't have to be on.
And the other thing is, I noticed in my last video, I had bags under my eyes because, as I was mentioning, I had just gotten the job, and having a couple of restless nights in a row, it looked like I was a zombie. And I looked at the video after I finished it, and I was like, "Oh, good God!" I mean, I was like, it kind of looked like this, and I was like, "Oh my God, there's a bags under my eyes."
James, there's always bags under your eyes.
You know what? Get out of here. Well, that pretty much wraps it up here on this show, and who knows? After that comment, Bryan not.
Yeah, I might never be on again. That's right. That's right.
Well, we will be back next week, and our mystery guest said he will be on. So
cool.
Well,
looking forward to it.
The anticipation keeps building, fans. I'm sorry. The anticipation too is, for me, just unpalpable. Anyways, thanks for listening in to or watching this podcast /vidcast. I am James Rowe. Thanks again, Bryan. We'll see you next week.
Thanks.